Hi guys. Tonight we begin a slow, shadow-draped journey into the fog-laced alleyways and soot-streaked windows of Victorian London. Our story isn't just one of survival, but of quiet endurance, of an invisible boy with no name, no home, and no future, learning to find warmth in a world built to forget him. In this tale, you'll hear gas lamps hiss against the damp, smell coal smoke clinging to threadbare coats, and feel the slow ache of hunger that creeps into bones when days stretch too long. This is how to survive Victorian London, if you're small, alone, and entirely real. The boy had no name, not one he remembered. If someone had whispered it to him once, that sound had long since been swept away in the noise of clattering carts and the ever-turning churn of boots on cobblestones. He had been born to the darkness between doorsteps, in a place where sighs echoed louder than lullabies, and scraps of bread were a rarer kindness than sunlight. He slept beneath the broad wooden curve of Smithfield Market's meat carts, where stray dogs kept company and men in aprons shouted before dawn. The smell was terrible, blood and offal and old sawdust soaked through with years of slaughter, but the wood shielded him from rain, and sometimes, if he waited until the porter looked away, he could sneak a dried rind of fat or a butcher's bone still glistening faintly with marrow. He was perhaps 7, perhaps 10. He didn't know. He was small enough that people didn't see him until he was already there, crouched near their boots or curled between their crates. And by then it was too late to do anything. Most didn't care. Some muttered. A few reached into their pockets and left behind an apple core, a ha'penny, or on rare days, a crust of bread so hard it had to be soaked in rainwater just to chew. Morning in London did not rise with grace, but with the churn of industry, horses shrieking down narrow lanes, boys with soot-blackened faces clambering up chimneys, and the clink of bottles from the milkman's cart. The city had a sound like it breathed through iron lungs, wheezing and whistling, always working, never still. The boy moved with it, like ash on the wind. He had his roots. The bakery behind Paternoster Row, where the flour sacks leaked just enough to gather in small mounds along the cobblestones. The rag-and-bone man near Fleet Lane who'd trade a tin spoon for a lump of cheese rind, and the drunkard's alley behind the Black Bull Tavern, where discarded mugs sometimes still held a trickle of warm ale. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because silence was safer. Boys with voices were boys with stories, and stories were dangerous things in a world like this. If you remembered too much, it hurt. If others remembered you, it was worse. So he kept still and kept quiet, with eyes always watching and fingers always ready to snatch or steal. But not all of London was stone and coal and steam. There were pockets, little folds in the city's thick skin, where something like kindness could be found. One such place was the small courtyard behind St. Dunstan's Church, where ivy grew unchecked up the brick and pigeons clattered softly in the morning gloom. An old woman named Mags came there every day, with a sack of stale bread and a voice like smoke. She never looked straight at him, but she always tossed one crust a little farther toward the shadows. She'd hum to herself, old sailor songs, mostly, things she probably didn't even know she still remembered. Sometimes, if the bread fell too near her feet and he hesitated, she'd murmur, "Go on now, little ghost. Eat before the rats do." He never replied. But once, after a week of sharp rain and empty bellies, he left behind a bit of coal he'd nicked from a passing cart, tucked into the corner where she usually sat. She said nothing the next day, only tossed 2 pieces of bread instead of 1. By then he had learned about the workhouses. The big stone prisons where orphans went to be stripped of everything, their hair, their freedom, their small name-stained memories. The boys came out pale, strange, like the ghosts of themselves. He'd seen one once, thin as wire and coughing blood, turned out for stealing a crust. They said he'd die by week's end. They were wrong. He was dead by nightfall. So the boy kept to his alleys and corners, away from the inspectors and their long, cold fingers, away from the matrons with their sour breath and iron keys. He preferred the damp, the chill, the hunger. Those things, at least, didn't pretend to love you. By the time autumn came, he had a rhythm. Days were for scavenging, nights for shelter. He knew where the grates let out warm air from the kitchens beneath the Guildhall. He knew which chimney sweeps were too drunk to notice a boy asleep under their wagon. He even knew how to steal a match, light it under his shirt, and feel something like heat. But as leaves began to rot in the gutters and fog clung closer to the street lamps, something changed. One morning near the old bakery, he heard a cry, thin, high, and out of place in a city so used to pain. It wasn't a call for help. It was just a sound, like loneliness made into a song. He found her behind the barrel stacks. She couldn't have been more than 5. Hair tangled, dress torn, barefoot. She had the wide, wet eyes of someone who hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be. She looked up at him like he was a miracle. "Are you the ghost?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He said nothing, but he sat down beside her, and when night came, he gave her the bread he'd saved all day. They never exchanged names. She didn't ask where he came from, and he didn't ask why she cried in her sleep. They became shadows, side by side, 2 phantoms clinging to the edge of the world, teaching each other how to breathe without being seen. The city didn't notice, but somewhere in the cracks of its soot-slicked skin, something had begun to shift, small, slow, and very nearly invisible, and so began the winter. The fog came earlier now, curling around lamp-posts like the slow fingers of sleep. It rolled in off the Thames, heavy and damp, carrying with it the smell of fish guts, coal tar, and the 1,000 other unwashed secrets of the city. It wrapped the streets in silence, and within that hush, the 2 small figures learned to move as one. They did not speak often. Words were still dangerous, but they understood each other in the language of glances and gestures, in the way she reached for his coat when the wind howled, or how he always made sure she was tucked behind him when footsteps neared too close. He started calling her Little Dot in his mind. She never gave him her name, and he never asked. She was so slight, so easily missed, that she seemed more a smudge on the world than a person. But she followed him without hesitation, her tiny hands clutching at the hem of his coat like it tethered her to the earth. Some days they found enough to eat. Some days they didn't. On days they didn't, they curled up together in a coal scuttle behind the tannery, where the air stank of dye and rot, and slept until their bellies forgot to ache. It was in this bitter lull, as the first ice began to bloom on the river's edge, that they met the man with the silver buttons. He was standing beneath an archway on Fleet Street, one gloved hand resting on a cane with a wolf's head carved into the top. His coat was long and fine, velvet-lined, and gleamed even through the grime of the city air. But what caught the boy's eye, more than the shine, more than the elegance, were the buttons. They were too bright, too clean, as if they had never known London at all. "Hello, urchins," the man said, his voice lilting, too smooth to be trusted. "Lost, are we?" The boy's first instinct was to turn and vanish, but Dot was tired that day, slower. Her foot caught the edge of a stone, and she stumbled forward just a step. The man reached out, catching her gently by the elbow. "Easy now, little sparrow." The boy stepped in between them, eyes hard. The man smiled, not cruelly but not kindly either. "Protective. Good. You'll need that." He didn't ask their names, didn't ask where they came from. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 pieces of hard sugar candy, wrapped in waxed paper. The boy stared at them. He hadn't tasted anything sweet in months. "For the girl," the man said, placing 1 candy in Dot's small palm, and 1 for the brave shadow at her side. Still, the boy hesitated. Dot had already unwrapped hers, her eyes wide with wonder as she tucked it into her mouth. "Take it," the man said softly. "There's no trick in kindness, not always." The boy took the candy. He didn't eat it. He would save it for later, for a darker day. Before they could vanish back into the alleys, the man spoke again. "When the frost turns the Thames to glass," he said, "follow the music. There's warmth for ghosts if they're willing to walk toward the sound." Then he turned and was gone, his silver buttons flashing once more before the fog swallowed him. For 3 days after, the boy thought of little else. The words itched in his mind. Who had that man been? Why had he helped them? And what had he meant about the frost and the music? On the 4th morning, they woke to find frost curled like lace over every surface. The Thames had begun to still, not fully frozen but slowing, thickening with the bite of deepening winter. That day, they stole a half-eaten pie from a windowsill. Not because they wanted to, but because the cold had slowed their blood and made their thoughts sluggish. Hunger made them bold. The woman who lived behind the window saw them. She screamed. A boot came flying out the door, missing them by inches. They ran down winding alleys under drooping laundry lines, past shivering dogs and chimney boys too thin to cry. When they finally stopped, panting and trembling, they found themselves near the river. It was quieter here, the fog heavier, and from somewhere across the water, a sound, faint, slow, like a violin played just on the edge of memory. They looked at each other. No words, just a question in their eyes. He nodded. They followed. The sound led them across narrow footbridges and slippery docks, past men unloading barrels and coughing into rags, past women with cracked red hands hauling pails of fish guts into the freezing dark, and there, beneath the iron ribs of Blackfriars Bridge, they found it. A fire. Not a great one. Just a small barrel, flames licking from its centre, and around it a circle of children, all ages, all silent. The music was coming from a boy not much older than himself, playing a violin with strings so thin they shivered under his fingers. The tune was soft, strange, lilting like a lullaby hummed by someone half asleep. No one spoke. No one asked where they had come from or why they were here. One of the older girls moved aside, making room by the fire. Dot sat first, holding her hands out to the warmth with a quiet sigh. The boy followed, his eyes never leaving the violinist. Later, someone passed a scrap of roasted chestnut to Dot. She took it, broke it in half, and gave the larger piece to him. They stayed there until the fire began to dim and the violin fell silent. When they finally rose, the girl who had made space for them said softly, "Same time tomorrow, if you can find your way back." The boy nodded. He would. The candy was still in his pocket, unwrapped now. He held it in his palm, letting the stickiness melt against his skin. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely alone. The fog thickened overnight, curling under doorways and slipping into dreams. It muffled footsteps, swallowed shouts, and softened the outlines of the world until London felt like a half-remembered place, drifting somewhere between sleep and silence. The boy woke before Dot, still curled under the edge of a discarded rug they'd found in a corner of the market, now stiff with frost. Her breath puffed out in pale clouds. He watched her sleep for a long moment before slipping away. There were errands to be done before the sun rose fully, if it chose to rise at all. Some days the sky never lightened, only shifted from one shade of grey to another. But early hours meant scraps, and scraps meant survival. He moved along the edge of Cheapside, where the fishmongers sometimes threw out heads or tails not fit for sale. He was fast, not fast enough to avoid the curses, but quick enough to dodge the kicks. 2 fish heads and a strip of bruised eel skin made their way into the ragged sack tied at his waist. Next he crept down by the bakery again, not to steal, just to smell. Sometimes scent alone could soften a morning. But today, to his surprise, a familiar hand waved him closer. Old Bess, the flour-streaked baker with a soft spot for ghosts. She tossed a heel of yesterday's loaf toward the alley. "Share it," she grunted. "I saw you with the girl." He nodded, caught the bread mid-air, and ducked away before her softness could sour. By the time he returned to Dot, she was awake and shivering, her hands cupped beneath her chin like she was trying to catch warmth from her own breath. When she saw the bread, her eyes lit, and when she saw the fish heads, her nose wrinkled. But she didn't complain. They ate together in silence, savouring every chew as if it were a feast. Later, as the day waned, they made their way back toward the river, toward the bridge where music and warmth had bloomed like a hidden flower the night before. But something was different. No sound, no fire, only a thin trail of smoke curling up beneath the bridge, already fading into the winter sky. He hesitated. Dot looked up at him, questioning. Then a whisper from the shadows. "You came back." The girl with the hollow cheek stepped forward, her arms wrapped tight around her chest. She nodded once, then turned, beckoning them forward. The violin boy was there again, but he wasn't playing. He sat cross-legged, his instrument resting in his lap, fingers twitching as though still chasing the last of a vanished tune. Around him the others stirred, a small gathering of the forgotten. Each of them had their own rhythm, their own silence. Some stared at the ground, others at the sky. A few watched the boy and Dot with the quiet intensity of those who'd long since learned to measure threat by movement alone. The girl spoke again. "The man with the silver buttons. He told us about this place." That made the boy's eyes narrow. He hadn't expected to hear of him again. He said we'd find others, she continued. Said warmth draws ghosts together. Dot nestled closer to the boy, her hand finding his and staying there. They spent the evening near the fire, sharing what little each had brought. A lump of coal, a bent tin spoon, a singed crust of meat pie. One of the older boys, lanky and red-eyed, had managed to pinch a potato. They roasted it whole, passing it around in soft, reverent silence. Even Dot was allowed 2 bites. When the fire burned low, the violin boy lifted his bow once more. He played a tune none of them knew, a slow, winding melody that sounded like snow falling on rooftops. It had no beginning, no end. Just a quiet ache that wrapped around them like a blanket. The boy didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back to the wall, Dot curled against his side, eyes fluttering in dreams. He watched the others, the way they moved, the way they breathed. And for the first time, he wondered if there could be more than just surviving. If perhaps, hidden beneath the grime and the hunger, something like belonging was possible. The next morning brought frost so thick it painted the windows white and made the street lamps glow like trapped stars. The city was slower, quieter, as if even the rich had begun to feel the weight of the season pressing down. The boy and Dot made their way to the market, only to find most stalls shuttered. A butcher offered them a frozen pig's ear if they would scrub blood from the flagstones. The boy took it. Dot gagged at the smell, but she didn't let go of his hand. Later, near the tanner's yard, they came across something new. A flyer, half torn and flapping against the wall. Warm beds, clean water, orphan relief, sponsored by the Society for the Rescue of Street Youth. Dot pointed at the picture, a sketch of smiling children beside a fire. He tore the flyer down. They knew what such places promised. He'd seen boys go in and never come back. Heard whispers of workhouses disguised as charity, of hands calloused before their 10th year, of beatings administered in the name of God and progress. They burned the paper in a tin pail behind the bakery. The flames danced high for a moment before dying into smoke. That night, the bridge was empty again. No fire, no music, no children. Only the Thames, moving slow and dark beneath the weight of the cold. Dot looked up at him, eyes wide and uncertain. He didn't know what to say. He only knew the silence felt heavier now, as if something had been taken. But before despair could settle in, he saw it. A smear of chalk on the brick near the archway. A mark, simple, a crude drawing of a violin. He touched it once, gently. They weren't gone, just moved. He took Dot's hand, and together they followed the music only they could still hear. The mark led them east, past the bend of the river where the docks narrowed and the warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. The air there was different, heavier, sour with the scent of salt, damp rope and rat droppings. The boy had been here before, once, during a desperate spring when he'd tried to follow the merchant barges for a bite of rotted fruit or a chunk of mouldy biscuit. He remembered the dogs that slept in chains, the men who drank gin at sunrise, and the strange languages that floated through the fog. But this time, he had Dot's hand in his. This time, he walked with purpose. They found the second mark near a crumbling stone stairwell leading down to the river's edge. Another chalked violin, this time drawn with a star beside it. Not a real star, just 5 crooked lines intersecting, but it was enough. Beneath the stairwell, half hidden by tarps and discarded crates, was a tunnel. Narrow, dark, and thick with the stink of algae. Dot hesitated, but the boy squeezed her hand, stepped forward, and ducked inside. It was colder down there. The stone walls dripped with river water, and their footsteps echoed louder than they should have. But after a few turns, they saw light, and then fire. This place was smaller than the space beneath the bridge, more a hollow tucked into the bones of the city than a proper room. But the children were there, huddled, quiet, awake. The violin boy looked up when they entered. He didn't smile, but he gave a small nod. The others shifted to make room. Dot let go of the boy's hand and slipped into the warmth, nestling beside one of the older girls who tucked a wool scrap around her shoulders without a word. The boy sat beside the fire, watching the flames lick at the edges of the darkness. No one asked what had happened to the bridge. They all knew better than to speak names aloud. Safer to let stories drift unspoken, like smoke into night air. Later the violin boy began to play, a slower tune this time, Not mournful, but still touched by something ancient, the sound of waiting, of watching, of surviving longer than anyone expected you to. One of the boys passed around a tin cup of something warm. Not tea, but close enough. They all sipped. The warmth burned, but they welcomed the burn. It meant they could still feel. After the music, they talked. Quietly, in fragments. About where to find dry matches. About a woman near Whitechapel who gave away boots with holes in the soles if you smiled at her right. About a dead rat left by a cat in exchange for a stroke on the head. These were the exchanges of their world. Kindness for silence. Food for risk. Warmth for loyalty. It was in this haze of low voices and flickering light that a new child appeared. He stood at the edge of the fire's glow, tall for his age, with dark skin and wide, wary eyes. His coat was too short in the sleeves, his trousers torn, but his shoes, they were whole. Scuffed, but whole. "Name's Caleb," he said after a long pause. That was bold. Most of them didn't share names, but he stood there, chin up, as if daring them to care. The violin boy nodded again. The boy watched Caleb, curious. He carried himself differently, like someone who had known Holmes before. Maybe not for long, but long enough to remember what a bed felt like. Dot curled into his lap, already half asleep. He held her gently, tucking the wool scrap higher around her shoulders. Before dawn, they moved again. Not far, just another tunnel, deeper, drier. The boy helped carry Dot. The others whispered about watchmen, about rumours of children being taken from under bridges, about questions asked by people who didn't care about answers. They moved like ghosts, trained by necessity. Every sound measured, every step considered. The new space was strange. Not a tunnel this time, but an old storage room, long forgotten, beneath a wine merchant's warehouse. The air smelled faintly of cork and dust. There were empty shelves, a pile of broken barrels, and one old mattress stuffed with straw. It was paradise. They divided the space quickly, instinctively. Older ones near the door, younger ones tucked deeper in. The violin boy sat near the back, bow in hand, but unmoving, as if listening for something beyond the stone. The boy and Dot took their place near a crooked shelf stacked with crates. It offered a kind of wall, and Dot liked walls. They stayed like that for 3 days. No one left alone, always in pairs, always silent. The boy learned more about the others during those quiet days than he had in weeks. The girl with the hollow cheeks had a limp she tried to hide. Caleb could sew with surprising precision. The red-eyed boy had a whistle that mimicked a nightjar, a warning call, low and unmistakable. And the violin boy, his name was Elias. Someone whispered it once and it stuck. No one dared say it to his face. But they all knew it now. Elias didn't talk much, but when he played, it was as if the fire leaned closer to listen. On the 4th night, something changed. The wind shifted. The city outside stirred more loudly, and from the grate near the ceiling, their only view to the world above, they heard it. Boots, not random ones. Boots that moved with purpose. Voices, low clipped. Dot stirred in her sleep. The boy covered her ears gently. Caleb crept toward the grate, slow as breath. He listened. Then he hissed one word that sent every child into motion. Inspectors. They moved fast. They had a plan. They always had a plan. But the boy's heart thudded louder than it should have. Dot was so small, so tired. He lifted her into his arms. She didn't wake. The violin was left behind. No one had time to save the music. The streets above were harder than they remembered. The stone was colder, the wind sharper, and every echo of a footstep felt like it might belong to someone hunting. The boy cradled Dot close, her face buried against his collar, her breath shallow but warm. She was still asleep, or perhaps pretending to be. She did that sometimes, closing her eyes against the noise until it faded. They moved fast, not recklessly, but with the speed born of deep, worn-in fear. Elias led them, his pace unbroken, his coat flaring like a wing as he ducked through alleys and slipped beneath rusted iron gates. Caleb followed behind, scanning over his shoulder every dozen steps, his breath visible in tight, controlled puffs. The others fanned out. They'd done this before. Disappearing was an art form, and they had long since become its quiet masters. They didn't speak, not even in whispers. Words made noise. Noise drew eyes. Eyes brought the men in black coats with thin lips and questions that never needed answers. They reached the old tannery by nightfall. The air there was thick with the sour stench of lye and hides, but the building had long been empty. Its roof sagged in places, but it stood. That was all that mattered. Inside, they scattered through the shadows. The boy found a quiet corner beneath a shattered window and lowered Dot gently onto a patch of dry straw. She stirred then, eyes fluttering open, and for a heartbeat, she looked as though she might cry. But instead, she reached up and brushed a hand against his cheek, more to reassure him than herself. He sat beside her and pulled the tattered coat tighter around them both. The others settled in nearby. Elias sat near the hearth, long cold, his violin gone, his hands twitching as if still searching for the strings. Caleb paced near the door, eyes sharp, shoulders tight. The girl with the limp unpacked a bundle of cloth and began doling out crumbs, careful not to make the paper rustle. There were only 8 of them now. 2 had gone missing since the tunnel. One of them, small Peter with the burnt sleeve, had vanished without a sound. No one dared ask aloud if he'd been taken. They knew what happened to children who were taken. The boy leaned his head back against the wall and listened to the tannery breathe. Old buildings did that. Creaked, sighed, shifted like sleepers trying to roll over in their dreams. It comforted him, oddly, as if the city itself still remembered them. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled between the boards and rattled the broken shutters. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Closer still, a voice, high-pitched, slurred, sang a half-forgotten tune about a sailor's grave. Dot shivered. He pressed his hand against her back and rubbed slow circles until her shoulders stopped trembling. That night, Elias didn't play. There was no fire, just silence and sleep that came too fast and too deep. When the boy woke, it was to the sound of whispering, not close, but near enough to matter. He sat up slowly, every muscle tight. Dot was still asleep, her thumb tucked into the collar of his shirt. The others were awake too, crouched or curled, ears turned toward the wall. Voices on the other side. 2 men, one with a thick accent and boots that scuffed instead of stepped. The other with a sharper tongue slicing through the early grey. No sign, but they've been here. Fresh tracks. I told you, check the river. They always circle back to it. There's no patience left. Mr. Dean wants results. A pause, then footsteps moving off. The boy didn't breathe until the silence returned. Elias motioned once, a subtle tilt of the head, and they all began to gather their things. The tannery was no longer safe. By midday, they were moving again. This time, they split into pairs. Safer that way. Less noticeable. The boy and Dot took the south road, looping toward the edge of the city where the houses were smaller, the lanes narrower, and the fog never quite lifted. They walked past rows of chimneys, coughing smoke, past children in shoes too big and coats too thin. They passed a woman with a basket of rags who stared at them with cloudy eyes but said nothing. When they reached the brickyard, they stopped. It was half abandoned, with stacks of misshapen red clay blocks and a shed leaning dangerously to one side. A boy stood inside, watching them. Not one of theirs. Not yet. He was thin, dirty, but his eyes were sharp. "Looking for ghosts?" he asked, voice low. The boy didn't reply. Dot stepped forward and pointed at the ground. The boy in the shed followed her finger. There in the dust, drawn in the faintest line of chalk, was the crooked star beside the violin. His face changed. "Come on then," he said, turning into the dark. Inside, the air was warmer, just barely. There were more of them. 5, maybe 6, all younger than Elias's group. Their eyes tracked every movement, but no one spoke. The violin was here, not Elias's. Smaller, older, strung with wire that looked like it had been salvaged from window frames. But one of the children held it with reverence, and the boy understood. It wasn't about the instrument. It was about the music, the mark, the memory. They were part of something now, something that stretched from alley to bridge, from grate to rooftop. A trail of warmth left behind by those who refused to disappear. That night Elias arrived. No words were exchanged. Only a soft tune, drawn from borrowed strings, rising into the air like smoke from a long-dead fire. The boy awoke to the low hum of music drifting through the brickyard shed like fog threading between stones. It was not a melody he knew, but it felt familiar, as if it had lived in his bones long before he heard it. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim, dust-hung morning, and found Dot still asleep beside him, her small hands curled into fists beneath her chin. One strand of her hair stuck to her cheek with dried tear salt. She hadn't cried aloud. She never did. But the cold had made her dreamless, and the boy knew that was worse. He sat up, the stiffness in his back unfolding like old hinges. Across the room, Elias stood with the borrowed violin, head bowed over the instrument, coaxing a tune out of its warped frame with aching tenderness. Around him, the younger children sat in a circle, unmoving, their eyes not on Elias, but on the music itself, the invisible thread it wove between them. One girl, perhaps 6 years old, with cheeks smudged and a nose that hadn't been wiped in days, held a chipped teacup filled with something warm. She passed it to the next child without a word. When it reached the boy, he sipped. Weak broth, but hot. Dot would have the rest. The older boy who'd first welcomed them, the one with the cautious eyes and scabbed knuckles, approached then. He crouched beside the boy, studying him. "We call this place the kiln," he said, voice low. "Not 'cause it works, just 'cause it used to." The boy nodded, understanding more than what was said. "They moved again," the older boy continued, glancing toward Elias. "Your lot. Some went north, some east. Can't stay still too long. The men in coats came by 2 nights ago, asking too many questions." The boy remembered the voices outside the tannery, the clipped orders, the name spoken with edge, Mr. Dean. He didn't know the man, but he knew what kind of power wrapped itself in such calm threat. The boy looked at Dot, still asleep. She needed rest, needed food, needed things the world had long forgotten how to give. The older boy followed his gaze. "She's strong," he said quietly. "That one, quiet strong." "She doesn't talk much," the boy replied, and surprised himself by saying it aloud. "Doesn't have to," the older boy said. "Some folks say the best ghosts never do." Later, when Dot woke, they shared the rest of the broth and sat together on the broken bricks outside the shed, watching the sky. It was not blue. It never was. But the fog had thinned, and that felt like a gift. Elias joined them as the day sank lower. He moved like a shadow, his hands never still. The violin was cradled against his back now, wrapped in a bit of frayed blanket. He looked tired. All of them did. But there was something else in him too. A kind of restless urgency that made the boy lean forward, listening even before Elias spoke. "We're leaving again," Elias said simply. "Tonight." Dot looked up. "Where?" "North, to the canal. There's talk of a warehouse there, boarded up. Dry. Someone said there's a man who leaves bread behind the fence, regular." The boy nodded. "When?" Elias looked toward the chimney stack. "After dark." The journey north took them through the belly of the city, past shop fronts with windows frosted from the inside, past chimney sweeps coughing blood into rags, past factory doors that never closed, not even at midnight. The city was awake always, grinding its teeth and swallowing children with every breath. Dot walked the whole way, never complained. She held the boy's sleeve in one hand and tucked her other fist into her coat pocket to keep it warm. Her lips were blue by the time they reached the waterway. The warehouse stood like a hunched old man at the edge of the canal. 3 stories high, bricks blackened by age and soot. The lower windows were smashed, jagged teeth of glass still clinging to the frames. But the door was closed and whole. Elias tried it. Locked. One of the younger boys, no older than 7, wriggled through a narrow broken pane and vanished into the dark. They waited, holding their breath. A moment later, the door creaked open from the inside. It was colder within than without, but dry. That alone made it valuable. Inside, the floors were wide and bare, strewn with splinters and rusted nails. Ropes hung from beams above, swaying gently as if remembering cargo long forgotten. In the far corner, beside a collapsed crate, was a bundle. Elias knelt beside it, unwrapped it. Bread, 2 loaves, still warm, and beside it a single word carved into the crate's side. Ghosts. The boy stared. He didn't know who had written it. But he understood. Somewhere someone saw them, knew them, remembered. That night they lit no fire. The smoke might betray them. But Elias played, softly. A lullaby, perhaps, or something like it. Dot fell asleep with her head on the boy's shoulder, and in the shadows beyond the broken windows the city watched without speaking. The warehouse became a kind of home, in the way a coat becomes a second skin when it is the only thing between you and winter. It was not safe, not really, but it was known, and in London, known things were precious. The brick walls groaned at night, settling into themselves with old aches, and the canal outside whispered cold secrets beneath a crust of forming ice. The boy and Dot shared a corner with a broken crate for a pillow and an old horse blanket that smelled of salt and ash. Each night they curled close beneath it, her breath warm against his chest, her fingers always seeking his, as if afraid he might disappear in his sleep. She didn't speak much still, but her eyes had grown steadier, watching the others, learning their movements, mimicking their silences. The others had begun calling themselves the Ghosts, not as a game, but as something like a name passed down from those who had come before. There was no leader, not really, but Elias was the one they looked to when the air grew sharp or the footsteps outside changed rhythm. He didn't ask for it. He didn't speak of it. But when he moved, they followed. And now he had begun drawing maps. Scraps of paper stitched together with soot and string. Not of the city in any proper sense, no street names or clear boundaries, but a network of hiding spots, forgotten tunnels, warm grates and food sources that came and went like tides. He marked them with shapes, stars for kindness, crosses for danger, open circles for fire. The boy watched him work, memorizing each line. He began to see the city not as a monster, but as a broken thing, full of hollowed ribs and sheltering bones. Dot watched too, head on her folded arms, her eyes flickering to each mark with a quiet hunger. One day, she would know it better than any of them. He believed that. One evening, just after the hour when the factory whistles stopped and the world exhaled its soot-filled breath, they heard it, a knock. Not on the door, on the outer wall, 3 soft raps evenly spaced. Every child froze. No one moved. Even Elias stopped mid-bow, the unfinished note lingering in the air like fog trapped in a bottle. The knock came again, 3, then 2. Caleb stood slowly. He was the tallest now, his shoulders thickening beneath the layers of tattered cloth. He moved to the window slit and peered out. A pause. Then he let out a breath and stepped back. "It's her," he said simply. The children waited as the door creaked open, and in stepped a girl none of them had seen in weeks. Her name was Wren. She had vanished the same night the tannery emptied. Rumours had whispered that she'd been taken, or worse. But here she was, wrapped in a man's coat 3 sizes too large, her hair cut short, her boots mismatched but laced tight. She carried a tin pail in one hand and a rolled blanket tied with twine in the other. Elias moved to her, silent. She didn't smile, but she nodded once. "I found something," she said, "out near the canal bend. A place, warm, dry, and a woman." That word, woman, hung in the air like smoke from a rare fire. Wren went on. "She doesn't ask names, just leaves food, has a stove, says if you're quiet and don't steal, she won't ask where you came from or where you're going." Elias studied her. "What's the price?" Wren shook her head. "I don't know yet, but it's better than here." The boy felt Dot shift against him. Her fingers tightened around his. That night they held a vote, not by hands or words, but by movement. Those who rose and began to gather their things were choosing to go. Those who stayed seated, eyes wary, were choosing the warehouse. Half stood. The boy didn't. Dot didn't either. Not yet. They watched as Wren and Elias and 6 others vanished into the fog once more. The warehouse grew quieter, lonelier, but not empty. The next day, the boy climbed onto the roof. The ladder was rusted, the beams slick, but he knew the city looked different from above. And it did. From that height, he saw the curve of the canal stretching like a sleeping snake, the chimneys vomiting smoke into the grey sky, the flickering gaslights like distant stars. He saw people. Not clearly, just shapes, hurrying below with scarves tight around their faces and purpose in their steps. And for a moment, he imagined being one of them. Someone who moved forward, always forward. When he climbed back down, Dot was waiting. "I want to find her," she said. Her voice was barely more than a breath. But it was clear. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. That night, they packed what little they had. The bread crust, the bone comb, the 2 buttons he'd saved from an old coat, and followed the last trail of chalk arrows leading toward the bend in the canal, and whatever waited beyond. The fog grew heavier as they walked, rolling in off the canal like a living thing. It clung to their legs, crept beneath their collars, blurred the gaslights into trembling orbs. The boy kept one hand on Dot's shoulder, the other tucked into the folds of his coat. Fingers curled around the bit of stale bread they hadn't eaten. Every step echoed in the hollow hush of the lane, and though they passed others, dock workers heading home, women carrying baskets, a man wheeling a barrow of broken crockery, no one looked directly at them. Ghosts moved quietly in London, and the living had learned not to stare. The chalk marks were harder to see now. Wren had drawn them low, near gutters and brick corners, each one smaller than the last. A triangle, then a pair of vertical slashes, then a circle with a dot in the centre. That last one was the sign they all recognised, the eye of a needle, or so Elias had called it. It means go small, he'd said once. Go quiet. Dot pointed to the symbol and gave a single nod. They turned off the lane, slipped between two crumbling stone buildings, and found themselves in a narrow alley choked with weeds and rusted iron. At the end was a door. Not grand, not locked, just a wooden thing, half swollen with damp, framed by broken tiles. It looked abandoned, but something about it. The way the paint had been recently brushed clean from the handle, the faint scent of coal smoke behind the boards, told them otherwise. The boy knocked. Once, then twice more. There was a long pause, long enough that he considered turning back. Then a click, not loud, not fast, a sound like breath being held, then released. The door creaked open. The woman stood in shadow, framed by a flicker of firelight behind her. She was neither young nor old, dressed in a plain wool coat with the sleeves rolled up. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, and her face, weathered, thin-lipped, pale, bore the look of someone who had known loss intimately but didn't wear it like a badge. "You're late," she said softly. Dot shrank back. The boy stepped forward, hand still on her shoulder. The woman didn't move. She waited. Then, slowly, she stepped aside. Inside, the air was warm. Not hot, but warm, like the inside of a coat worn all day in the sun. The floor was stone, uneven but swept clean. A fire crackled in a small iron stove near the far wall, and there were pallets laid out across the room, 6 of them, each with a blanket, each neatly folded. The room smelled of ash and bread. He hadn't smelled bread like that in months. A few other children were already there. The boy recognized one, a freckled girl who'd once traded a coin for a button in the tannery. She glanced up, eyes flicking over them, then returned to her bowl. The woman closed the door gently behind them. "You'll not speak unless you must," she said, walking toward the stove. "No shouting, no singing, no wandering near the windows." The boy nodded. Dot copied him. "There's food," the woman continued, ladling something into bowls from a battered iron pot. "If you help, water in the basin, wash before sleep. Anyone wakes with fleas, out. You steal, you lie, you scream, out. You stay quiet, stay kind. You'll last." She handed them each a bowl. The broth was thin but rich with onion and something meaty beneath. The boy handed Dot her portion first, watched her cradle it like a miracle. The woman turned her back and returned to her stool beside the stove. She didn't ask their names. She didn't care where they came from. She simply kept stirring, kept watching, like a lighthouse scanning for wreckage. That night, they lay on their pallet, bellies warm for the first time in days. The firelight danced on the ceiling, and the sounds of the city were muffled by thick stone walls and careful silence. Dot whispered once, a single word, "Safe?" The boy didn't answer aloud, but he pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, tucked her hand into his, and listened to her breathing slow. The woman stayed up all night. She never moved, just sat beside the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug, eyes drifting from the flames to the door and back again. The boy didn't sleep much. He watched her in the darkness. She reminded him of someone he couldn't quite recall, a shape in a memory, a voice from a dream, someone who used to hum songs while stirring soup. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the tune, but all he heard was the soft crackle of coal and the city exhaling around them. By morning, the city had lost its voice beneath a blanket of hoarfrost. Roofs shimmered with pale lace, and chimney smoke hung low and unmoving in the still air. In the quiet warmth of the stone room, the children stirred one by one, blinking sleep from their eyes, blinking disbelief from their breath. No one spoke. There was only the soft rustle of wool and straw, the hush of bare feet against worn floorboards. The boy awoke to find Dot still curled beside him, her hand tucked beneath her cheek, the faintest smile tracing her lips. He had never seen her smile in sleep. It looked borrowed, fragile, like something she might lose if he breathed too loudly. He rose carefully, letting the blanket fall in slow folds, and crept toward the basin. The water was cold enough to sting, but he scrubbed his hands and face all the same. The sting felt good, real. Proof that this moment, this place, was not just another dream the city would take from him. The woman was already awake, of course. She hadn't left the stove all night. The fire had died to embers, but she stirred them now, coaxing them back to life with steady hands and a few pieces of kindling from a basket. Her movements were practiced, almost quiet enough to seem like prayer. She glanced at him once, then nodded toward a small shelf. Wood, she said, just that, no more. He understood. He went. Outside, the frost painted everything silver. He stepped carefully over the threshold, boots crunching on salted stones, and made his way to the narrow yard behind the house. A pile of logs leaned against the far wall, already split. He filled his arms, the cold biting through his sleeves, and returned quickly. By the time he returned, Dot was awake and sitting cross-legged on their pallet, her eyes watching the fire as if it were a story being told only to her. The woman ladled porridge into bowls. Not sweet, not spiced, but warm and filling. The children ate in silence, all except one boy, perhaps 6, with curls that hung in damp ropes around his face. He coughed as he ate, the sound deep and wet. The woman turned toward him. "Drink slow," she said. He obeyed. That afternoon the boy helped sweep the floor. Others scrubbed bowls, folded blankets, stirred the pot. There were rules here, but they weren't cruel ones. You helped, or you didn't eat. You stayed silent, or you left. But if you followed those rules, you were not cold, and you were not alone. Dot stayed close to the fire most of the day, her small hands pressed together like she was memorizing the shape of heat. She spoke only once to the boy, when he returned from fetching water. "She reads," she whispered. The boy frowned. "Who?" Dot nodded toward the woman. He watched her then, not just her movements, but her eyes. They did move like someone who read stories, who saw more than what was in front of her. At night, when the children slept, she sometimes opened a small book by firelight. He caught only a glimpse, thin pages, black letters, before she closed it again and tucked it into her coat. She never spoke of it, never offered to read aloud. But the boy began to wonder if the stories she kept were the ones that had kept her. That night it snowed. Not the thick, wet kind that turned to slush by morning, but dry, whispering flakes that fell like feathers from a ruptured sky. The children crowded near the window, eyes wide. Even the girl with the scabbed elbows gasped softly when she saw the white dust gathering in the alley. Snow meant hunger for most in the city. It clogged the alleys and silenced the bread carts. It pushed the men back into gin halls and left the streets to the silence of boots and bone. But here, for one night, it was beautiful. The woman opened the door just wide enough to let the children step out, one at a time. No running, no shouting, just wide eyes and quiet awe. Dot lifted her hands to catch the flakes. She held them out like treasure before they melted in her palms. The boy didn't smile, not quite, but he felt something lift in him. Later, when the fire burned low and the room began to doze, the woman did something she had not done before. She opened the book. The children stilled. One by one, heads rose from folded arms, eyes turned toward her. She did not look up. She simply read. Her voice was not soft. It was steady, low and unadorned, like a thread of wool running through cold hands. She read of a boy who followed a fox through a forest, who faced a river that did not freeze, who found warmth in a place no one believed could hold it. The story had no end. Not that night. She closed the book before the boy reached the other side of the river. "You sleep now," she said, and they did. All except the boy. He lay with his eyes open, listening to Dot's even breath, watching the shadows on the wall shift as the fire breathed its last. He didn't know if the story was real, but he knew this. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wanted to hear what happened next. The snow did not stop. It thickened overnight, a soft siege of white that sealed doors and swallowed streets. When morning came, the world outside the stone room was a silence deeper than any the children had known. The city was still there, of course. The chimneys still smoked, and somewhere carriages would still creak and groan along the main roads. But here, tucked between forgotten alleys and the frozen mouth of the canal, it felt as though the world had paused. The boy woke to find the fire had been stoked. The room was warmer than usual. Dot still slept, her nose barely poking out from under the blanket, her dark hair tangled across her cheek. Her small chest rose and fell in rhythm with the slow crackle of the coals. The woman was already moving, spooning porridge into bowls, checking the basin, rearranging folded rags. She never hurried, never stumbled. Every movement she made was with intent, as though waste of time, of energy, of breath was a crime she could not afford. The children rose slowly. The frost had numbed their limbs during sleep, and they stretched like old cats testing the air for pain. No one cried. No one complained. It was too early for tears and too cold for words. Breakfast was quiet. The boy shared his portion with Dot. He always did now. The woman never remarked on it, but her eyes lingered a little longer on them each morning, watching, not judging, just seeing. After the bowls were washed, the woman gathered them all near the stove. "Snow won't lift soon," she said. "You'll stay in. No wandering, no sound. The men out there are quieter in snow, but that only makes them hungrier." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need to frighten them. The fear was already there, crouched behind their ribs like a stray dog waiting to be fed. "You'll take turns," she continued. "3 to a task, 2 by the door. The rest stay warm." She didn't assign. She didn't command. She spoke, and the children moved. The boy found himself beside Caleb and the girl with the ribbon always tied too tight around her wrist. Their task, sweeping snow from the path behind the house, not to clear it for use, but to break the illusion that no one lived there. Too clean was dangerous. Too hidden, worse. Outside, the snow stung their faces. It was dry, brittle, and hissed when it landed on skin. The boy kept his eyes down, feet moving in the pattern Caleb showed. One pass forward, one drag back. Even. Unnoticed. He thought of the city beneath the snow. How many ghosts like them were buried beneath its white hush? How many fires had gone out? How many had never been lit? Back inside, Dot was helping with clothwork. She couldn't sew, not properly, but she was good with folding. Hands small enough to twist strips of rag into neat bundles, her fingers pinching and pressing like a girl who had once been taught, once had a mother who showed her how. The boy watched her unseen and felt a quiet pull inside him. Something between pride and sorrow. He didn't know which hurt more. That night, the woman opened the book again. No introduction. No softening. She read where she had left off. The boy in the story had crossed the river. He was cold, soaked through, his hands blue. But the fox had waited on the other side, and together they followed a trail of stones into the woods. This part of the tale was darker. The woods were not empty. There were things that moved among the trees, things with eyes that glowed and teeth that whispered. The children listened, breath held, leaning forward. But the boy didn't fear the story. Not really. He feared its silence. The moment when the voice would stop, the book would close, and he'd be left alone with the ending unfinished. When the woman shut the book that night, there was no sound in the room but the crackle of ash. She looked up, her eyes settled on the boy, then on Dot. "You'll go tomorrow," she said quietly. He blinked. "Where?" "West end of the yard. There's a man in a butcher's apron who leaves meat out for the dogs. Some of it's good still. You take a sack. You ask no questions. You say no nothing. You take what's left." Dot looked at him, her eyes unreadable. He nodded once. That night, sleep came like a thief. It took them one by one, gently, without warning. And for the first time, the boy dreamed of the fox. Not as an animal, but as a voice. Walking beside him through trees that whispered his name in snow. Morning broke without sunlight. Just a slow grey brightening that crept between the window boards and touched the floor with cold fingers. The boy was already awake when the others stirred. He sat with his back to the stone wall, watching the fire die, listening to the scrape of the woman's spoon against the pot as she stirred the day's first meal. Dot was still asleep, arms tucked close, face turned toward him, trusting even in dreams. The boy rose when the porridge was ready. He ate quickly, mechanically, and saved the last few spoonfuls for Dot, who accepted the tin bowl without speaking. Her eyes were clear, but there was something tight in the way she blinked, a tension that had grown each day, like a thread being pulled tighter inside her. The woman gave him a sack. Empty, rough spun, mended in 3 places. She handed it over without a word, but she did give him a look, long and level. He nodded. Dot came to stand beside him at the door. She wore 2 coats now, both too large, one belted with twine at the waist. Her boots were stuffed with cloth, and her hair had been tied back with a strip of frayed wool. She looked like a child made of scrap, a doll sewn from whatever the world hadn't thrown away. But she stood tall, eyes fixed forward. The path to the yard was treacherous. The snow had crusted over in places, and beneath it, the stones were slick with ice. The boy led, feet testing each step, sack clutched in one hand, the other reaching back to steady Dot when she slipped. The butcher's yard lay at the far edge of a row of workshops, behind a gate that never quite shut. The alley was narrow, cluttered with barrels and crates and reeked of brine and blood, but it was quiet, too quiet. The boy paused before they turned the final corner. Dot slipped her hand into his, not tight, not fearful, just there. They stepped into the yard together. The man was there. He didn't turn when they arrived, just kept working, hunched over a rough-hewn table, cleaving fat from bones, tossing scraps into a bucket by his side. His apron was stained, his boots crusted with old snow and soot. His breath rose in thick clouds. The boy approached slowly, no words, no eye contact. When he reached the bucket, he paused, waited. The man didn't look up, didn't speak. Then, with one wide hand, he reached into the bucket, pulled free a wrapped bundle and set it on the edge of the table. Not a scrap, a piece of real meat, trimmed but intact, small but whole. The boy stepped forward, took it, nodded once. Still no words. They turned and left, not fast, not slow, just steady. It wasn't until they were 3 streets away that Dot let out the breath she'd been holding. He knew, she whispered, about us. The boy didn't answer. Back at the stone room, the woman accepted the sack with a glance inside. She said nothing, but her hands moved faster, lighting the fire higher, pulling down the pot. The meat was cut, stewed with the rest of the week's broth, thickened with turnip and black breadcrumbs. That evening the children ate well. It made them quiet in a new way. Not the quiet of fear or habit, but the kind that comes when warmth creeps back into the body too fast and the soul is not sure what to do with comfort. After dinner, they sat in a circle, closer to the fire than usual. The woman didn't open the book. Instead, she spoke. "There are doors in this city," she said, "that don't go anywhere. You've seen them. Boards nailed across, bricks laid behind, a knob without a frame." The children nodded. They all had seen them. "But some," she continued, her voice even, "do lead somewhere. Not outside, not below, but across." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. The boy sat with Dot's hand in his. She was listening, eyes wide, not blinking. And in that moment, something changed. Not outside. The snow still fell, the wind still howled. But inside the boy, something shifted, as if a page had turned without sound, as if the story wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about finding the door. The next morning began with a knocking. Not the sharp knock of men in coats or the slow rattle of wind-thrown shutters, but a quiet, rhythmic tap from the far side of the alley wall. 3 times. Then 2. Then 1. The boy was the first to hear it. He had been lying awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the faint stirrings of the fire as it died to ash. Dot still slept, her breath soft and even, and he was reluctant to move, not because of the cold, but because of the quiet between them, a rare, still hush that felt sacred. But the knocking came again. He rose without waking her, crossing the room in stocking feet, and eased open the door just wide enough to peer out. The alley was cloaked in snow, nearly untouched, except for a trail of faint footprints leading from the wall to the edge of shadow. He stepped out, pulling his coat tight. The cold bit hard, but it felt distant, muffled by the lingering warmth of the room behind him. A figure waited at the wall. Wren. She wore the same oversized coat, patched at the elbows with the collar pulled up high. Her boots were different, thicker, dusted white with snow. She didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, a brightness he hadn't seen before. "You're still here," she said softly. He nodded. She needed rest. Wren's gaze flicked toward the door. "She's strong, stronger than most of us." He didn't respond. Wren pulled a parcel from inside her coat, wrapped in paper, tied with string. "They moved again," she said. "Elias and the others south this time, through the arches." The boy's brows furrowed. "Why?" "There's talk of someone new, not just the woman, a man. Carries a cane, wears silver buttons." The boy's heart skipped. "He's building something," Wren continued, "or trying to." She held out the parcel. "For her," she said. "Bread, cheese, 2 apples, one's bruised." He took it. "She can come," Wren added. "You too. We're leaving tonight." Then she was gone, back into the snow, her shape folding into the white like a thought forgotten. Inside, the boy unwrapped the parcel by the fire. Dot was awake now, sitting cross-legged with the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes went wide at the sight of the apples. They ate slowly, carefully, letting the flavours stretch across their tongues like something holy. The cheese was soft and sharp. The bread dense, still holding a hint of warmth. Dot saved her apple until last, turning it over in her hands like she didn't trust it not to vanish. After the meal, the boy told the woman. She didn't speak, just nodded once, then handed him a scrap of paper. On it, a sketch, rough, hand-drawn, of a row of arches, a canal beneath and 3 chalk marks, a triangle, a star, a cross. "Find the middle one," she said. "That's where you'll wait." Dot helped him pack. They didn't have much. A piece of soap, a roll of cloth, the fox pendant one of the older children had carved for her from driftwood weeks ago. The boy took the bone comb. Everything else they left behind. Before they went, the woman stopped them at the door. "You'll listen," she said to the boy. "Not just with ears, with your whole body. That's how you find the door." He didn't understand, but he nodded. They stepped into the snow. The arches weren't far, but the city stretched strangely in winter. Streets turned in on themselves. Landmarks vanished beneath white. The world felt folded, like a map pressed shut. They found the arches by midday. 3 of them, each the same width, same height, curving beneath the old bridge that spanned the canal. The first was blocked with crates and refuse. The third led to a locked gate, but the second was open, clean. Someone had swept the snow away from the stones beneath it. They waited. Dot sat with her back to the wall, the fox charm in her hands. The boy stood, watching the water. It moved slow beneath the ice, a black ribbon twisting under the pale crust. Somewhere above, bells rang. Not church bells, lighter. A cart, perhaps, or something else. Then a footstep. Elias. He stepped from the shadows beneath the far arch, violin slung across his back, coat pulled tight. He looked older than the boy remembered, paler, but his eyes were still clear. "They're close," he said. "Come on." He turned without waiting. Dot rose. The boy followed. They passed beneath the arches, through a narrow tunnel, and into a yard the city had forgotten. Brick walls rose high on all sides, lined with broken glass and moss, but in the centre was something new, a fire pit, lit warm, and around it, children. Not just from the stone room, not just from the tannery or the brickyard, but others, faces the boy had never seen. Dozens of them, sitting or standing, huddled in pairs, watching. And beside the fire, seated on a crate, was the man. The cane rested across his knees, the silver buttons gleamed. He looked up as they approached, and smiled. The boy felt Dot hesitate beside him. Her hand found his not in fear, but in the quiet grip of uncertainty. Around them, the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls of the hidden yard. Sparks rose like brief stars before vanishing into the snow-silvered dark. The man with the silver buttons sat still, one gloved hand resting lightly on his cane. His coat, that same black velvet trimmed with faded braid, looked heavier now, dusted with snow, as though he had walked far to be here. No one else spoke. The children around the fire only watched, some with curiosity, some with guarded silence. A few leaned into each other, too tired to wonder, too cold to care. The man tilted his head slightly. "You found the second arch," he said. "Good?" His voice was softer than the boy remembered, less polished, more worn at the edges, like a song played too many times on an old instrument. Elias stepped forward then, his violin still slung behind him, his face unreadable. "They were at the stone house," he said. "With her." The man nodded, a small, knowing gesture. "She keeps them well." He rose from the crate with slow, deliberate ease, as if standing were a decision made carefully. The firelight danced on the silver buttons of his coat, and for a moment the boy thought he saw something else reflected in that glint. Not just light, but memory. As if the buttons themselves remembered things, carried stories etched into their polish. "I have no name to give you," the man said, looking around at the children. "Not one that matters here. You don't need to know who I was." He paused, his eyes sweeping the group. "But I will tell you this. I was once a ghost too. Not in rags, not with cold feet, but a ghost all the same, unseen, unheard, lost in plain sight." A murmur passed through the crowd, not words, just breath shifting. "I wandered this city long before you," he continued. "I saw the doors she spoke of, the ones bricked up, the ones that lead not through but away." Dot watched him, unmoving. "You think survival is the end of the story," the man said. "That if you eat enough, stay warm enough, you've won. But surviving is only the first chapter." After that, he tapped the end of his cane on the frozen ground. You must begin to remember who you were before the city forgot you. The boy frowned. The man's eyes settled on him. You, he said. You're the quiet one. You listen. You've been listening since this began. The boy didn't answer. You've followed all the trails, the tunnels, the fire marks, the music. You've learned how to vanish, but now it's time to learn how to be seen. Behind him, Elias turned his gaze downward, his fingers twitching near the neck of his violin. The man gestured to the fire. I've built this place for that reason. Not a shelter, a memory, a beginning. He reached into his coat and drew out a small pouch. From it, he took a thin strip of leather, threaded through with a single key. It looked old, worn smooth with time, the teeth dulled by use. He held it out to the boy. Somewhere in this city, there's a door still open. The boy stared at it. Not everyone will go, the man said. Some will stay, some must. But if you want to find the place where ghosts walk in daylight, where no one asks you to vanish, you'll need to take this. The fire cracked. The cold crept close again. Dot reached for the key first. She didn't speak, just held it between her fingers, turned it once in the light, then passed it to the boy. He took it. It was warm. The man stepped back. You won't find the door in maps. It's not marked in chalk. It's in the places you only go when you've stopped running. The boy didn't understand, but he nodded. That night they stayed by the fire. No one was turned away. The children shared food. Whatever they had, and the snow fell quieter, softer, as if the world itself had leaned in to listen. Elias played eventually. Not for long. Just a few slow notes, like someone knocking on an old memory. And beside the fire the boy sat with the key in his hand, its weight pulling his thoughts inward. He didn't know where the door was, but he knew now he was meant to find it. Not alone. Never alone again. The fire burned low as dawn crept over the hidden yard, its light filtering through the crumbling brick like breath held too long. The children slept in tangled heaps, their forms outlined by frost-dusted coats and the soft rise and fall of weary lungs. A few still sat upright, heads resting on shoulders, hands clasped in sleep as if afraid to let go. The boy did not sleep. He sat where the warmth had held longest, just at the fire's edge. Dot curled against his side. She had drifted off hours ago, her breath quiet, the fox charm still clutched in her hand. The boy's fingers rested on the key tucked beneath his coat, its leather string looped once around his wrist. He had turned it over again and again in the night, feeling each groove, each nick in the iron. It was not like the other keys he had seen, not the sharp-edged kind used by wardens or workhouse men, nor the gleaming kind held by shopkeepers. This one was older. Its shape was crooked, its teeth worn, as if it had opened something many times and still waited to be used again. As the first bird stirred somewhere beyond the walls, the boy rose, careful not to wake Dot. He stepped over sleeping bodies, past Elias, whose violin now rested beside him like a sleeping cat, and toward the narrow arch that marked the entrance to the yard. The world outside was still pale and empty. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, and the sky hung low, heavy with the hush that comes before a change. He walked until he reached the edge of the canal, where ice lay broken in jagged sheets and the water whispered beneath. There he waited. He didn't know why. Only that something had shifted, and he needed to feel it in his bones before he could move forward. Wren found him just after sunrise. She appeared like she always did, without sound, without warning. Her breath clouded in the morning air, and she handed him a cup filled with something warm. Soup, she said, thin but real. He drank. It was more water than flavour, but the heat reached his belly and settled there like a promise. Where does it lead? He asked, nodding toward the key. Wren sat beside him, her coat creaking softly. No one knows, she replied. Some say it opens a door behind the old school on Crutched Friars. Others say it fits the lock on a cellar in Limehouse, beneath a house with a painted sun above the lintel. Some think it opens nothing at all. Then why give it to me? Wren shrugged. Because you're the only one who might try every door until it turns. He looked at her. And if it never turns? Then you keep walking. She stood, stretched her arms. Elias says you'll leave soon. The boy nodded. Where first? He didn't know. But later that morning, when Dot awoke and the others stirred to the scent of fire and thin broth, the boy made his choice. They would start with Crutched Friars. The name meant little to him, only something he had heard once in passing, a corner where a school once stood, abandoned after the plague had claimed too many of its children. The city was full of such places, buildings with doors sealed not by locks but by memory, windows where no one looked out anymore. They left after midday, after the man with the silver buttons disappeared once again without farewell, after Elias handed over a scrap of paper with markings that meant nothing but might mean everything. The children watched them go, some with envy, others with sorrow. A few turned their backs before they reached the archway. It was easier to lose things if you didn't look as they left. Dot carried their bundle, bread, the comb, a tin cup. The boy kept the key hidden, close to his heart. Crutched Friars was farther than he expected. The city folded around them in strange ways. Streets twisted, alleys narrowed, smoke drifted from chimneys that hadn't burned in days. They passed markets with nothing left to sell and wagons piled with coal that never stopped. When they arrived, the school was still there. 3 stories of stone and silence, windows boarded shut, door chained with rusting iron. Its roof was cracked, its yard overgrown, no laughter, no bells. But above the doorway, faint beneath years of soot and grime, the words still remained. Learn and leave. Dot stood at the gate, frowning. The boy stepped forward. He reached into his coat, drew out the key. It didn't fit the chain. That was clear. But something made him press it instead to the seam of the door. Just there, where wood met stone. Nothing. And then a click. Not the sound of a lock turning, but of something deeper. The door didn't open, but the wind shifted. Dot looked up, her eyes wide. "It's here," she whispered. He believed her. But not yet. There was more to find. And they had just begun. The wind curled down the narrow lane beside the old school, gathering dust and fragments of ice, scattering them across the broken cobblestones like whispered messages. The boy stood still, the key in his hand, his fingers tightening around it as if it might vanish with the next gust. Dot remained by the gate, her eyes fixed on the door that hadn't opened, though something in the air had undeniably changed. They didn't speak. There was no need. The key had spoken for them. A memory stirred in the boy, not a clear one, not with faces or voices, but a feeling, of being carried, of warm arms wrapped around him, rocking, a song, a door closing softly behind him, and then emptiness. That was the last thing he remembered before the streets claimed him. The school stood like a mausoleum, not of death, but of forgetting. Ivy clawed at its base, the boards over its windows had rotted into soft grey slats. The chains on the front door remained rusted, solid. But the seam the key had touched was still warm. He pressed his hand against the wood, and it felt like the breath of someone asleep on the other side. Dot stepped closer, her boots crunching softly. "It's not ready," she whispered. He looked at her. She nodded, just once. "We need something." He wasn't sure what, but she was right. The door had acknowledged them, but it hadn't opened, as if it required a password of the soul, not the tongue. As if the key alone was not enough. They backed away, the silence wrapping around them like a thin shawl. That night, they found shelter in the shell of a bakery just 2 streets over, a place long abandoned, its ovens cold, its windows cracked. Inside, it smelled faintly of flour and burnt sugar, like memory itself had refused to leave. They built a small fire with broken chair legs and warmed a piece of bread until it softened at the edges. Dot fell asleep first, curled beside the hearth, the fox charm in her hands, her breathing even. The boy sat awake again as he often did, listening to the wind run its fingers through the loose boards above. He turned the key over and over. It wasn't made for any ordinary door. That much was clear now. It had been touched by too many hands, worn too smooth, shaped by time rather than design. And then he remembered the woman's words. "You'll listen not just with ears, with your whole body." He hadn't listened. Not properly. He had followed lines on maps, chalk marks, whispers, but he hadn't listened for the city's voice. He lay down beside the embers and closed his eyes, and waited. What came was not a dream, but a presence, a hush. He stood again at the school's gate, though his body still lay by the fire. The fog swirled around him, soft and strange, and the building rose higher than it had in daylight. The words above the door glowed faintly, "Learn and live." He approached. The key in his hand was no longer iron. It shimmered with a faint blue light, pulsing in time with his breath. The door before him had changed too, no longer wood, but something older, like stone worn smooth by centuries of touch. He reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, he heard them. Voices, children's voices. Not crying, not shouting, singing, low and gentle, a melody made of sorrow and hope bound together. It wound through the mist, wrapped around him like a shawl. He opened his eyes with a jolt. The fire was nearly out, the bakery silent. Dot slept on. He rose, walked to the broken window and looked out at the sky. Snowflakes were falling again, but they drifted more slowly, as if reluctant to land. In that moment he knew where they had to go next. Not the cellar in Limehouse, not the painted sun above a lintel, not yet. They had to follow the song. He didn't know how, but the city would show them. It always did if you listened. The city stirred with a slow breath, its morning veil not one of gold, but a heavy ash grey that seeped from chimney stacks and curled around window panes. The boy stood beneath the fractured arch of the bakery's doorway, watching the world unfold without warmth. He held the key loosely now, not as a tool, but as a question. One he didn't yet know how to answer. Behind him, Dot stirred. Her steps were quiet, her boots dragging slightly, the wool coat slipping from one shoulder. She came to stand beside him, blinking up at the sky as if trying to read something in the slow-falling snow. "You dreamed," she said. He nodded. "The school?" He looked down at her. Her eyes were sharp, clear, too knowing for her age. She wasn't asking to be told. She already understood. "It sang," he murmured. Dot nodded once. "I heard it too," and she had. He could tell by the way her fingers closed around the fox charm without thinking, by the way her shoulders squared themselves, as if bracing for something invisible. They left the bakery without food. There was none to take. What warmth they'd borrowed was spent, and the city had already begun its slow turn toward the day's bitter core. But they walked with purpose now, not toward crutched friars, but away from it. South, into the tangle of lanes that crisscrossed beneath the old viaducts, where the air tasted of soot and wet iron, and the sound of dripping water echoed like footsteps behind your own. The song was not a melody they could hum. It was a feeling, a hum in the marrow, a pulse beneath the city's skin. They followed it through markets too empty for trade, past shivering dogs huddled beneath carts, and into alleys where the bricks seemed to lean close together as if whispering secrets. They found the first trace beneath an iron grate near Whitechapel. A single feather, dark as coal, lay on the stones, too perfect to be fallen from a passing bird. Dot picked it up and turned it in her fingers, then slipped it into her pocket without a word. The next trace was chalk. Not a mark on the wall, but a swirl drawn on the side of a drain pipe, half washed by rain, but still visible. It looked like a spiral, or the shell of something that once sang when held to the ear. They followed these fragments, each step drawing them deeper into the city's forgotten spine. By late afternoon, the snow turned to sleet. The sky pressed lower, and the streets began to empty. A cold fog seeped from the river, rising between buildings like steam from a sleeping beast. It was in this grey hush that they found the staircase. It wasn't marked. It wasn't hidden either. Just a narrow flight of stone steps tucked beside a collapsed wall behind an old public house, leading downward into a cellar no one had used in years. The iron handrail was rusted, and the first few steps were slick with moss. Dot hesitated. The boy placed a hand on her shoulder, and they descended. The door at the bottom wasn't locked, it wasn't even fully shut, just resting against the frame like something too tired to stand. They pushed it open. Inside was darkness. Not deep, not cruel, just complete. And then a sound. Not the song, not yet, just a breath, followed by the faint creak of wood shifting. They stepped inside. The door clicked behind them, not with finality, but like an old friend returning to sleep. The air smelled of lavender and dust, and beneath it, something older, paper, wax, ash. The boy reached into his coat and drew out the key. It glowed faintly, the way iron does when it remembers fire. Dot took his hand, and they waited. Then slowly the darkness lifted, not with light, but with shape. Bookshelves rose from the gloom, lined with volumes too aged to bear titles. A narrow table stretched along the far wall, and atop it a candle, unlit but fresh. Beside it a matchbox. The boy stepped forward, lit the candle. The flame caught quickly, dancing, and with it came the sound, not of music, not yet, but of pages turning, one after another, as if the city was ready to tell its story. The candle flame flickered gently, casting long shadows that trembled along the cellar walls. The boy stood still, holding the matchbox in his hand, while Dot moved carefully through the dim space, her fingers trailing the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the shelves that seemed to go on farther than the room should have allowed. The air was still, thick with the scent of old wax and parchment, and beneath it, something stranger. A softness, like breath caught in stone. The books were mismatched, bound in cracked leather or stitched cloth, their spines faded by age, some completely blank. There were no titles, no cataloguing, but Dot paused beside one with a worn violet ribbon tucked between its pages. She didn't open it. She simply touched the ribbon, lightly, as if afraid of waking something. The boy placed the matchbox on the table beside the candle and turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of the room's silence. It wasn't empty. Not truly, but filled with the hush of memory, of things once spoken and now sleeping. In the far corner, a second door revealed itself. Not by motion, not by sound, but by the way the shadows refused to cling to it. It was made of wood, darker than the rest, with iron hinges rusted orange-red, and a small brass knob so polished it seemed almost out of place. He approached it without thinking, drawn not by purpose but by instinct. Dot stepped beside him. She reached for his hand, then let hers drop. He didn't touch the knob yet. Instead, he leaned closer, listening, and there it was, the song, faint beneath the door, not with instruments, not a tune, but voices, children's voices, humming, a rhythm as old as their own breath, a lullaby for the forgotten. He stepped back, not yet. The room, he now understood, was not meant to be passed through. It was meant to be remembered. Each book a life, each shelf a path. Each whisper in the air a story folded into paper and left behind like a breadcrumb. "Dot," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the small candle flame like twin coals. "Pick one." She didn't ask which. She simply turned and walked the length of the nearest shelf, stopping once, then again, before selecting a slim volume bound in grey felt. The edges were frayed, no lettering, no decoration. She handed it to him. He opened it. Inside, the pages were filled with ink, fine handwriting, curling letters, the kind no child used anymore. But the words weren't stories in the usual sense. They were thoughts, dreams. He read aloud. The boy with the broken flute walked until the frost grew quiet. He carried no coat, only a pocket filled with stars. Dot tilted her head. "It's a map," she said, and it was. Not of streets, not of tunnels, but of meaning. Each phrase pointed toward a feeling, each name, not the real name of the writer, but something deeper, was a lantern lit along the path they hadn't seen before. The boy turned another page. She wore a dress sewn from old hymnals and spoke only in questions. At night, her voice echoed where walls once stood. The room seemed to draw closer, the candle's flame bending inward. They sat beside the table, book open between them, reading by slow turns. Each passage unfolded another shape, not of the city outside, but of the city beneath. The one hidden inside stories, stitched into lullabies and whispered through grates when no one listened. They stayed there for hours. Neither noticed the cold. When the candle began to sputter, the boy closed the book. The room had changed, subtly. The shelves now felt like guardians, not storage. The second door seemed smaller somehow, more intimate. Dot stood. They didn't speak. Together they walked to the brass-knobbed door. The boy reached into his coat and drew out the key. It was warm again. The lock accepted it like breath. The door opened slowly. Behind it was not another cellar, not a tunnel, but a room filled with golden light, and a figure sitting near a hearth, her face lined with age, her eyes soft with knowing. The woman from the stone house, but older. Or perhaps she had always been this way, and only now did they see her true shape. She didn't speak. She only opened her arms. Dot stepped forward, the boy followed, and as the door closed behind them, the song rose, not louder but clearer. It was theirs now, not to follow, but to carry. The warmth hit them like memory. Not heat, not fire, but a sense of something long ago held and now returned. The room they stepped into was small, its walls of smooth stone hung with tapestries that shimmered like frost touched by sunlight. A hearth burned low and steady at one end, its flames quiet, deep orange. The smell in the air was lavender and soot and something richer, something like old paper and boiled sugar. The woman sat in a worn chair carved from dark wood, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at them without surprise, her face as still as a pond untouched by wind. Dot took 2 steps forward, then stopped. Her shoulders rose with a breath too deep for someone so small. She did not speak. The boy stood just behind her, one hand still resting on the key, though it no longer glowed. It had returned to its cool iron weight, but it didn't feel diminished. It felt used, not spent, but fulfilled. The woman smiled gently, not wide, not soft, a smile like dusk, quiet and inevitable. "You found it," she said. Her voice was older than her face, not in years, in knowing. Dot nodded. "Once." The woman's gaze drifted to the boy. "Not just the door," she said, "but yourselves." He didn't answer. He didn't know how. She gestured to a small table near the fire, 2 chairs, a teapot, 3 cups. "Come, rest." They moved slowly. The silence around them was different here, not empty, not afraid. Just vast, the kind of silence that lets one feel small and safe at the same time. They sat. The woman poured the tea. It was dark and bitter, but not unpleasant. It warmed the chest, filled the space behind the ribs. "Many come close," she said, watching the steam rise. "Few listen long enough to find the song. Fewer still carry it with them." Dot tilted her head. "What is it?" The woman looked at her. "The city." And then gently, "Your city. The part they tried to bury." She poured another cup, slid it toward Dot. "There are 2 Londons," she said. "The one above of stone and smoke and coin, and the one beneath of story and silence and memory. They don't speak, but they hear each other." The boy watched her carefully. Every word felt like a riddle with no trick. "You came through because you remembered," she continued. "Not your name, not your home, but who you were when the world still let you be small, before it taught you to vanish." Dot's fingers curled around her cup. "You followed the music," the woman said. "You saw the signs. You made no demand, asked no promise. That's how the door opened." The fire cracked softly, like the pop of old wood releasing its last breath. The woman leaned back. "There is a place where the lost belong," she said, "but you must choose to carry its memory forward, or it fades." The boy finally spoke. "What happens now?" She turned to him fully. "That depends on what you do with what you've seen." He said nothing. She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out something small, a locket, its brass face dulled with time. She placed it on the table between them. "Inside is the next door." Dot leaned forward, curious, but the woman raised one hand. "Not yet," she said gently. "Tonight you sleep here." The hearth brightened. A second room waited behind a low arch, a bed, clean blankets, cushions arranged with quiet care. Dot rose first. She paused at the edge of the archway, then turned to the boy. "You coming?" He hesitated, then he turned to the woman. "Will you be here when we wake?" She smiled. "Only if you remember I was." Dot took his hand and led him into the sleeping room. The blankets were soft. The bed smelled of lavender. The silence held them like lullabies. And for the first time, the boy dreamed not of fleeing, nor of hunger. He dreamed of doorways that opened to light, and of cities that remembered their children by name. The boy woke in a room kissed by candlelight, not sunlight. The hearth had been banked, its embers soft beneath a shell of ash, and the shadows on the wall moved like breath drawn slow and deep. Dot still slept beside him, curled into the crook of the blanket, one arm stretched toward the floor where the fox charm had fallen. He reached down, picked it up, and placed it gently into her hand. Outside the archway, the woman was gone. But the locket remained. It sat in the exact place she'd left it, centered on the small wooden table, its brass face catching the fire's glow like it held something molten beneath. He stepped into the quiet room, half expecting the woman to speak from the shadows, but no voice came, only the pop of a single log settling into the ash. He sat before the locket, fingers resting just beside it, not yet ready to lift it. There was no rush. That's what the room seemed to whisper. He studied the walls again. The tapestries, once faint and distant in the glow of night, now showed clearer shapes, not scenes, not images in full, but impressions. A boy with a lantern in one, a door drawn in thread, a fox, a flame. Not quite memories, not quite dreams, but close. Dot appeared not long after, still wrapped in the blanket, her hair tangled, her cheeks touched with sleep. She sat beside him, eyes fixed on the locket, then tilted her head. "Are you scared?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, me neither." She reached out and touched the edge of the locket. It was cold, but not unkind. Together they opened it. There was no photograph inside, no keepsake, only a fold of paper, worn and yellowing, creased from years of being carried close. The boy unfolded it slowly, breath shallow, as though words might escape if he moved too fast. There were only 5 words. Remember who you were before. That was all. He read them aloud. Dot didn't speak. She just closed her eyes. The boy looked up. The room had changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but with the quiet shift of a memory rising to the surface. The walls now shimmered faintly, the light from the hearth pulsing in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. There was a sound, soft and steady, like a breath drawn through distant stone, the hum of something opening or something waking. Then he saw it. A third door, low, half hidden behind a tapestry. It hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, invisible until needed. He rose, Dot followed. They stepped to it, and this time no key was needed. The latch turned with the brush of his fingers. Beyond it was not another room. It was a stair, spiraling downward, carved from stone so smooth it looked poured from moonlight. He didn't speak. He took Dot's hand. They descended. Step after step, each breath quieter, each heartbeat slower. The air changed. It grew warmer, not hotter, thicker, not stifling. It smelled of cedar and river moss and something sharper, like the metal of bells. At the bottom they reached a platform, not wide, not grand, but filled with light. A circle of torches burned around the edges, each one reflected in still black water. In the centre of the room stood a mirror, not framed, not ornate, just glass, tall and narrow, rising from the floor like it had grown there. The boy stepped toward it. In its surface he saw them both, but not as they were. He saw Dot first, standing straight, her eyes brighter, her face free from the grey of hunger. She still held the fox, but her fingers no longer gripped it for comfort. She wore something simple, a coat not torn, boots not patched. Her eyes were still hers, but clearer. Then he looked at himself, and the world tilted. He saw not the boy in soot-stained sleeves, not the child who lived beneath carts or behind barrels, but someone else. Not older, not changed, just whole. His shoulders not bowed, his eyes not lowered, his breath easy, his face as it might have been if the world had let him remain soft. He stepped back. The mirror didn't follow. Dot looked up at him. "We're still us," she said. He nodded. "Yes, but more." He couldn't speak. His chest ached with something vast and quiet and impossible to name. They turned. Behind them another arch. Beyond it, nothing yet, but waiting. He looked once more at the mirror, not for reassurance, not for fear, just to remember. Then he led her forward. The arch led into silence, not the hush of sleep, nor the stillness of abandoned rooms, but a deeper quiet, the kind that feels like velvet pulled over the ears, soft and final. The boy stepped through first, the floor beneath him smooth as water-worn stone. Dot followed, one hand still brushing the edge of her coat, the other curled around the fox charm that had not left her side. There was no light in this passage, yet they could see. Not with their eyes, not entirely, but with memory, with something inside them that had walked this road before, even if their feet had never touched it. The corridor bent left, then right, winding like thought. At intervals, carvings marked the walls, not pictures, not writing, but patterns, swirls, spirals, lines that crossed and joined and separated. Dot ran her fingers over one, pausing as though listening. The boy did the same, and the stone hummed faintly beneath his palm. Then came the door, not of wood, not of iron, but cloth. A curtain of black velvet, thick as night, hanging from a rod of bone-white stone. It moved slightly as if stirred by breath, though the air did not shift. They paused, then pushed through, and stepped into starlight. It was not sky above them, but a dome, vast and hollow, carved from glass and studded with silver pins, each one glowing like a fixed star. The room beneath was round, its floor of dark marble streaked with gold veins. In its centre, a circle carved deep into the stone, wide enough for 10 children to sit side by side. But no one sat there. It was empty, waiting. Around the room, stone benches lined the walls, draped in woolen cloth and fur. Soft light pooled at their bases, and across from where they entered another figure stood, tall, robe-clad, face hidden beneath a hood lined with fox fur and stitched feathers. They did not move as the children approached, but neither did they seem startled. The boy stopped at the edge of the circle. Dot did too. The figure lifted one hand, palm open. In it lay a stone, smooth, flat, black. The boy stepped forward, took it gently. It was warm. The figure spoke then. Their voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It vibrated like wind through reeds. "You have crossed all doors." The boy said nothing. "You have remembered." Dot's voice was soft. "We don't know our names." The figure lowered their hand. "You do not need them." The boy held the stone. It pulsed faintly in his palm. "What is this place?" he asked. The figure turned toward the dome, where the stars flickered above them in patterns unfamiliar yet intimate. "This is the Library of the Unseen," they said. "The place where the world remembers what others forget, where the forgotten remember themselves." Dot's eyes widened. "Every child who passed in shadow," the figure continued, "who was lost to the cracks and the cold, they live here, not their bodies, but their songs." The figure pointed to the walls. There, just barely, the boy now saw shapes, hundreds, maybe thousands, etched in gold along the edges. Names, not in letters, but in marks, each unique, each pulsing faintly. "Your story joins them now," the figure said. The boy's hand closed around the stone. "Will we stay?" The figure's hood tilted slightly. "Only if you choose to." Dot looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, in the world above, the snow still fell. The hunger still hunted, the city still forgot. But here, something remained. Something quiet, strong. The boy stepped into the center of the circle. Dot followed. The figure stepped back, and the stars above them brightened, casting long rays across the marble floor. The stone in his hand pulsed once, then grew still. The boy closed his eyes and remembered the cold, the silence, the small voice that called him ghost, the firelight, the bread, the song. And he saw, finally, the thread that bound it all, not as a story of survival, but as a story of return. When he opened his eyes, Dot was smiling, and the stars above them had rearranged, forming not a map, but a face, his. The stars above shifted slowly, not with haste, not with grandeur, but like something waking after centuries of sleep. Their light pooled across the boy's face, softening the edges, warming the hollows beneath his eyes. Dot stood beside him in the center of the marble circle, her gaze lifted, lips parted slightly in wonder. She clutched the fox charm in one hand, but her other was free, fingers stretched open like she was reaching for a dream made real. The hooded figure stepped back into the shadows, no longer a guide but a witness. Their robes rustled once, not from motion, but from meaning. This was not their moment. It belonged to the children now. Above them, the stars continued their slow reformation, and in their light, the circle beneath began to glow, faint lines rising along the marble like veins of gold dust. They formed a spiral, ancient and precise, curling outward from where the boy stood. At each ring, tiny marks pulsed, not runes, not letters, but impressions, names not written but felt. Dot stepped lightly around the spiral, each footfall landing on a golden mark. With every step, her posture straightened, her breath deepened. She turned once to the boy, and her voice was soft but clear. "They're waiting." He understood, not people, not the city, but the other children, the ones still wandering in the soot, still sleeping beneath carts and behind shutters, still clutching cold rags to their chests, still listening for music that never quite came. The boy knelt. He placed the black stone on the floor in the center of the spiral. It rested there, still, as if it had always belonged. Then he took from his pocket the key, the old iron one, worn smooth from days of clutching, turning, hiding. He held it up toward the light. Dot knelt beside him. She reached into the pouch at her side, one of the few things they'd carried from the world above, and drew out the feather they'd found near Whitechapel. She placed it beside the key, then the fox charm, then a strip of paper from the book in the cellar, then a crumb of bread wrapped in old cloth, then the locket. Each piece placed in a circle around the stone. A memory, a map, a mark. As they lay the final item down, the stars overhead flashed once, not bright, not loud, but deep, like a breath taken by the sky itself. And then the song returned. It filled the chamber not like sound, but like light. Not melody, but memory. Voices not just of the two of them, but of others. Dozens, hundreds. A chorus of children who had walked cobbled streets with bare feet, who had watched frost curl over windows from the outside, who had learned to speak with silence and run with shadows. The Library of the Unseen trembled with their presence. Dot took his hand. The song built, swelled, wove around them like a warm wind. The spiral beneath began to spin, not fast, but slowly, as if turning pages in a book written long ago. The black stone glowed, the key melted into light. The fox rose into the air and spun once, casting golden fur and flame. And the spiral opened, not into a hole, not into darkness, but into a path. A road paved in pale silver light, stretching forward into mist. The boy looked at Dot, she smiled, and together they stepped forward. Not to leave the city, not to escape it, but to carry it, all of it, in the story they had become. Behind them, the figure raised a hand, not in farewell, but in blessing. The path closed as they passed, and above, in the dome of stars, their names joined the others. Not as marks of loss, but as memories that would not be silenced again. The path ahead stretched into mist, not blinding but veiled, like breath rising from still water. The boy and Dot walked side by side, the soft silver road curving gently through nothingness. No walls, no ceiling, no sky, only a pale openness that hummed with a low vibration, as though they walked inside a memory still forming. Their footsteps made no sound. It was not silence that followed them, but reverence. As if the path itself had waited, patient and quiet, for their arrival. Dot glanced sideways, her fingers still laced through his. Her fox charm glinted faintly with each step, catching the ambient light that had no source. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her grip was enough. Not tight, just certain. The boy looked ahead. With each step, the air grew warmer. Not summer warmth, not fire, but something like a shawl draped over shoulders, familiar, comforting. The kind of warmth that reminded the body it had not been forgotten. And then the mist parted. They stepped into a space shaped like a dream, an open courtyard ringed by tall iron lampposts, each one lit with a flame that flickered but never burned. Between the posts, walls of ivy climbed higher than the eye could follow, rustling without wind. In the centre, a fountain, but not of water. Instead, a pool of glowing ink, deep and slow-moving, shimmering with every shade of memory. Around the courtyard sat children. Not many, not at first. But as the boy's eyes adjusted, more shapes appeared, curled in corners, perched on ledges, seated on steps. Boys and girls, some older, some younger, some with soot still streaked on their cheeks, some wrapped in coats too large, some barefoot, all silent, all watching. Dot's voice broke the stillness. "Are they real?" The boy answered with the truth he didn't know he knew. "They're echoes." They walked to the edge of the fountain. The ink within moved without ripples, slow and thick, alive. When the boy looked down into it, he saw not his reflection, but flashes, glimpses, a hand reaching for bread, a mouth pressed against a cold wall, laughter in an alley, tears falling silently in a gutter. His life, but not just his. He stepped back. One of the children seated near the fountain stood, a girl with braids and mismatched shoes. She held out a book, bound in soft blue cloth, no title, no mark. "For you," she said. Her voice was no older than her years, but it carried the echo of a lullaby hummed in the dark. The boy took it. Inside, the pages were blank. Dot leaned closer. "What's it for?" The girl pointed to the sky. There was no sky, but above, faint shapes moved, outlines of birds, doors, lamplight, faces. "To remember," the girl said. Then she turned and sat again. The boy looked at the book. He held it close. Dot touched the edge of the fountain, then turned her palm upward. Ink clung to her fingers like a thin glove, but it didn't stain. Instead, it shimmered, showing a name. Not hers, not spoken aloud, but the shape of her. They stood in the centre of the courtyard. More children gathered now, each watching. Not with hunger, not with fear, with recognition. The boy turned to Dot, and slowly they began to walk again. This time through the courtyard toward another archway that had not been there before. Its frame was carved with patterns they had seen in the cellar. Spirals, stars, the eye of the needle. Beyond it lay something bright. Not sunlight, not fire, just brightness. He looked at her once more. Dot nodded. Together they passed through the archway. And the moment they did, they heard the music again. Not from ahead, from behind. Dozens of voices, the children in the courtyard singing. Not a song of sadness, not farewell. A song of continuation, of threads picked up, of stories remembered. And as they walked on, the pages of the book in the boy's hands began to fill, slowly, line by line, word by word, written not by ink, but by steps. The brightness ahead was not blinding, but patient. It did not rush forward to meet them, nor did it retreat. It simply waited, filling the space beyond the arch with a soft, steady glow. The kind that lingers behind closed eyes after warmth, after memory, after dreams. The boy and Dot stepped into it, leaving the song behind, but carrying its echo in their breath. The path beneath them changed as they walked. No longer silver, it now shimmered with colour. Blue like river stones, green like moss between paving bricks, gold like lamplight on fog. With each step it shifted, not like something unstable, but like something alive, something listening. The book in the boy's hands grew warmer. It pulsed faintly, like a second heartbeat. He looked down and saw the first lines written clearly now, etched into the page in a hand that matched no pen he'd ever known. The boy who listened. The girl who remembered. Dot leaned against his side for a moment, just long enough to rest her head against his shoulder, and then they walked on. The corridor opened into a long gallery. Tall windows flanked the walls, though no sun streamed through them. Beyond the glass, the city slept. Not as it was, but as it might have been. Chimneys that did not belch smoke, streets swept clean, markets where every stall held food, children with faces unshadowed by fear. The boy paused at one window, hand resting against the glass. He saw himself. Not this self, but the younger one. The one who ran beneath carts and ducked behind barrels. Small, fast, hungry. He watched as the younger version of himself curled beside a grate for warmth. And then someone sat beside him, Dot. Even in this vision she did not speak. She simply leaned against the boy and handed him a crust of bread. The boy stepped back. The glass held no reflection, only memory. Further along the gallery, benches lined the way, not empty. Each held a figure, not alive, not moving, but still present. Some were wrapped in shawls, their hands folded in prayer. Others stared at the windows with empty eyes, lips parted as if trying to speak. Dot approached one, a man in a long coat, one hand holding a crushed bowler hat. His boots were scuffed, his collar torn. She looked up at the boy. "Do they wait?" she asked. He didn't know. But the woman in the stone house had once said, "Some doors stay closed until remembered." Perhaps these were doors. The path bent again, and ahead stood a gate, wrought iron, not high, but closed. At its centre, a keyhole. The boy reached into his coat. The iron key was gone. But the book glowed gently in his hands, and as he opened it to the centre, he saw something new. A shape cut into the page, where a thin silver key now lay nestled. Dot reached forward and lifted it carefully. The gate opened without resistance. Beyond it, a field. Not wide, not wild, just open. Grass swayed without wind. Flowers bloomed along the edges, trees leaned over low stone walls, and in the centre a table. Long, wooden, weathered, set with bowls, cups, bread, and across from it, children. The ones from before, not just the courtyard, the bakery, the tunnel, the bridge, the firelit yard, all of them. Elias, Wren, Caleb, Mags, even the boy who never spoke but whistled like a nightjar. They sat or stood, hands outstretched, not in welcome, not in surprise, but in knowing. Dot's breath caught in her throat. She took the boy's hand. They stepped into the field together. The grass did not bend beneath their feet. It welcomed them, like a place long lost, like a home. The field was warm beneath their feet, even through the threadbare soles of their boots. Each blade of grass shimmered slightly, like dew caught sunlight where no sun touched. The air was still, but not silent, filled with the soft rustle of unseen leaves, the hum of memory returning to itself. The boy and Dot walked forward slowly, their fingers still interlaced, the book pressed between his arm and side, glowing faintly with each step. The table waited. Long and low, its wood worn smooth by time and care. Bowls of porridge, baskets of bread, cups of warm milk, fruit too ripe for market but perfect here, food not laid for feast but for gathering. Around it stood the children, the ones whose names had never passed through courts or papers, whose lives had been measured in frost and firelight. Elias met them at the table's far end, his violin slung again at his back. He smiled, a quiet thing, the corners of his mouth rising as if remembering something too private to say aloud. "You came through," he said. Dot nodded. "So did you." The boy looked around. Wren leaned against the nearest tree, her eyes brighter than he recalled, the bruises beneath them gone. Caleb tossed a stone gently between his hands, humming a tune without notes. Others, children who had walked alongside them in dreams, in tunnels, in streets, they smiled as though they'd always known this moment would come. There were no seats at the table, no need. The boy and Dot approached, and as they did, the others stepped aside, leaving room not just for them, but for all they had carried, the hunger, the cold, the silent nights. Dot placed the fox charm on the table. The boy laid the book beside it. A breeze passed through the field then, soft, wide, golden. It carried the scent of bread and old paper, of rain on brick and coal smoke long gone. It wrapped around them all, stirred their hair, touched their cheeks, lifted their chins. The table was no longer just a table. It became something older, something remembered. It became a story, told not in words, but in presence. A place where ghosts did not vanish, but sat and shared warmth. A table that stretched as far as it needed, that never emptied, that held space for anyone who had ever wandered too far into the night. Dot turned to the boy. "Do you think the city knows?" He looked toward the horizon, where the path they'd walked now dissolved into light. "I think it always did," he said, and perhaps it had. Perhaps the city had never forgotten its children at all. Perhaps it had simply waited, quiet and watchful, for someone to stop running long enough to remember the music. Elias drew his violin, not to perform, to accompany. The song began softly, wordless, like wind through curtains, like the breath before a name is spoken. The children gathered. They did not eat quickly. They did not shout. They shared. The boy sat with Dot beside him, the book open on the table, the pages filled with words he hadn't written. The boy who listened. The girl who remembered. The city that watched. He did not need to add more. The story was still being told, not by him, but by all of them. And far away in some corner of London, beneath a grate or behind a shutter, a child stirred in sleep, heard something faint, a violin maybe, and dreamed of warmth without fear. Dreamed of a door that would not close. Dreamed of a name that would not be lost. The wind carried the story onward. London slept and remembered.